So, hello, this is our first dialogue regarding the project South-North Dialogues on Democracy, Development and Sustainability. I am Cristina Reis, Professor of World Political Economy and International Economics and Macroeconomics at the Federal University of ABC, Brazil, since 2013. Currently, I'm coordinating the NEEDS, Núcleo de Estudos Estratégicos de Desenvolvimento, Democracia e Sustentabilidade, Center of Strategical Studies on Development, Democracy and Sustainability at the Federal University of ABC, Brazil. Last year, I concluded my postdoctoral research at the Technische Universität Berlin. Unfortunately, I don't speak Dutch, I don't speak German, and I have a PhD and Master of Sciences in Economics at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, also in Brazil, and my research interests are global value chains, development, political economy, and the structuralist theory. Today, I have the pleasure to dialogue with Ingrid Harvold van Caving, and then you please correct me about your surname, Ingrid. And she's a lecturer in international development at the University of York's Department of Politics. Her research is centered on the role of finance in development, structural features of underdevelopment, the political economy of development, and critically assessing the economics field. She's also a founder and editor of the blog Developing Economics, founder and steering group member of Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics, and coordinator of the Association of Heterodox Economics, among other things. She has a PhD in economics from the New School and the MSc in development studies from the London School of Economics, LSE. So we are here together to talk about global value chains and some actual changes and transformations we are seeing during the pandemic and that are likely to continue when luckily this pandemic finishes. As you have been hearing about, there were many disruptions during these global value chains, including in pharmaceutical chains and also health chains that really jeopardized the economic, political, and social dynamics in many countries, both from the developed and the developing world, right? So global value chains is a term that became known during the beginning of this century, and it means the fragmentation of the activities and tasks related to the production processes of all the goods and services that are being produced worldwide. Global value chains can be considered the other face of the International Division of Labor, but this term GVC, global value chains, became very usual in the main narrative of the multilateral institutions, meaning the way that the production is organized internationally. So we, both Ingrid and me, we have a critical view of the International Division of Labor, and we're going to talk about this, starting by the question regarding what are the main productive, technological, and financial transformations in process. So maybe Ingrid would like to begin giving us a bit of theoretical approach behind this view of global value chains.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. I'm very excited about this dialogue. Global value chains is a really interesting concept because you could approach it for so many different theoretical angles, and it's great to have this kind of critical dialogue about what they mean and how we should think about them. And it's although it's something that's used, like you were saying, by the multilateral institutions, in the mainstream view, it's used by the World Bank and the IMF and other institutions too. And they often take a very narrow view of kind of industrial upgrading, and like they just look at the firm and what the firm needs to do in order to upgrade. And it's this assumption that anyone can kind of follow these specific policies and then upgrade and eventually become a high value added producer, which is very different from what how critical scholars originally envisioned it. And it came from world systems theory originally, which is like a very critical Marxist scholarship. But it's then been co-opted by mainstream economists as well. Coming from this critical literature and the commodity, I think it was called commodity chains at the time. It's like those scholars situated it in the International Division of Labor that you mentioned, Christina, where they looked at like the technological content or production, and this is also what dependency scholars looked at, like all the constraints to technology and that are much more severe and for firms in the global south, ownership of production, how that impacts the domestic economy and who can produce and who owns the technology or can access technology as well, and the potential for spillover effects as well among like different kinds of firms, which is really important for like development more broadly. So if like a country enters a global value chain at the very bottom, the potential for spillovers will be very different depending on the type of industry, which is kind of ignored in the mainstream global value chain literature. So I think drawing on the kind of traditional old critical scholarship can be really valuable when studying global value chains. There are quite a few scholars that are doing it, besides us, in the world, of course, including like, quite a few. I was thinking about Itan Suwandi in Indonesia, has a whole book on global value chains in Indonesia, where she kind of draws, I don't think she explicitly draws on dependency theory, but she's like implicitly drawing on a lot of the same insights. Looking at like the role of the state and like mediating a lot of the development challenges, and the power asymmetries, which I think probably we're going to talk more about throughout our conversation within the chains, and of course the global circumstances that shape what kind of upgrading possibilities there are. So that's just one example, but there's quite a few different people looking at this across the world. So yeah, do you want to talk a little bit more about like the?
Let me make some comments on that, because I think that you have already put so many aspects here that we start. There are two things that make us different from the mainstream narrative. First, we consider that the labor market does not work as with market clearing, and we think that there is unemployment and structural unemployment in the labor market, and when we consider this, the whole result of the equilibrium between quantities and prices, and I mean static and dynamic change. So this is one of the theoretical standpoints that we can never forget when we, and also forgive. This was like, because to consider that there is market clearing in the labor market, and then in the others is a bit nonsense in my view. And then the other one, if analysts have this demand side point of view, is to consider that there is uncertainty in economics. So, these uncertainties are not really measurable in terms of risks. And so when there is uncertainty, all the way to build expectations change. And then the results are really, the results in terms of equilibrium in quantities and prices of the different markets really depends on the demand side of the economy. And then when we have these two huge challenges to consider, to understand the economic dynamics, it's very difficult to keep or to stick on the individual approach or the individualism methodological approach and the instrumental rationality. So that's why we prefer the structural approach and not the individual one. I don't know, maybe I was not clear enough. I don't know if you like this idea of dividing things.
Yeah. Really good, and because you're much more specific about the theories, which I think is great, especially for people listening that maybe don't know so much about like the actual theories underpinning the GVC literature. And I think often the mainstream literature itself is not that clear on these things. It just kind of states it and assumes it. But I would probably add, so the labor market one is really good. And that's very problematic, and we shouldn't forgive it or forget it. Certainty, but then also, of course, international trade theory is also very important and distinguishes the critical camp from the mainstream camp, which assumes that comparative advantage is, leads to benefits for everyone. And we can see in the World Development Report from this year or last year from the World Bank, it explicitly talks about the benefits of comparative advantage and following your comparative advantage, and doing that through global value chains, which Ben Selwyn, who's a Marxist here in the UK, he had the paper out recently who criticizes that report specifically. Are taking a Marxist approach and saying that, no, actually, this is like a very oligopoly-driven system where you need to look at the power asymmetries to understand the inequalities that are being produced. So yeah, I would add that as a third thing, trade theory.
Perfect. Yeah, and then if we look at the international trade without believing in comparative advantages, then we have to look at what are the main sources to development. And then this is the actual contribution that I believe that the Latin American structuralist theory and brought to the debate, let's say. So when we talk about structural problems like the technological constraints, the uneven class relations, and also the uneven gender and racial relations too. When we look at the low productivity and the low wages level, and the very big contingent amount of people that are available to work, and so there is a kind of excess of labor supply. And when we look at also the institutional matters like the property rights, the regulation of properties in the global south, let's say, which are much less democratic, and this is one of the main interactions, I believe, between development and democracy, because maybe as much as democratic are the institutions of a country, maybe the development conditions rise, in the sense that the political economy of the states and the institutions, juridical institutions, legal institutions, will be more equitable, right? It can be, that's the hypothesis, and but not always, because there is always China, but this is a big discussion. But this can be one explanation for assert a number of countries, not of the entire world, let's say. And then other institutional aspects that are important are the macroeconomic regime, and also what are the fiscal, industrial, trade policies that are regulating the interaction between the tradable activities of the country and the no tradable activities. So, and then just to pick one of the that you have mentioned before. So what kind of spillover effects and linkage effects the productive specialization and the trade specialization are bringing to the whole dynamics of the economy? So these are some structural and institutional aspects that structuralist theory usually emphasize. Yeah. But regarding the dependency theory, you, as you said, you come from the world system analysis, and maybe you could on the contribution of the dependency theory to understand the relations between the peoples, the classes, between countries.
So I don't. I mean, I don't personally come from world systems theory, but yeah, global value chain analysis does. But I've written a lot on dependency theory. So I think beyond what I said already, so dependency theories. So I would say plural, since there's so many different theories, and like as you know, in Latin America, the debate is like extremely rich and like not really any agreement. But I think there are some key insights. And one is this like polarizing tendency or uneven development, this view of uneven development that the periphery is in this position that they're kind of being exploited by the core, and there isn't like they're not going to naturally catch up. And that is the object of study. And of course, a lot of dependency theorists were writing before global value chains were really a thing, but it's still something that's really important to and still relevant to look at in terms of how the peripheral countries are being integrated into the global production structure. And then I guess the attention to how this has like a very historical longue durée history, that there were like institutions that were developed during colonialism that were very extractive and that were basically established to serve the core or the colonizer, that are kind of difficult to, like if you just leave them and then, free markets and assume equilibrium, you're going to have increased inequality as well. And then there's the attention to specific constraints as well that I think you didn't directly talk about, but you did bring in the whole macroeconomic regime and stuff that a lot of dependency theorists did look at, and how the economies are just so vulnerable to shocks from outside, and the swings of the global economy, the business cycle, and demand from the core. So they need to have more active macroeconomic tools available to them, in addition to kind of industrial policy, in order to counter the sort of historical legacies of colonialism that have created what you were talking about, like low value added, low wages, weak kind of production structures. So I think those are some of the key insights we could bring from dependency theory that are equally, if not more relevant with global value chains, I would say, even if they weren't necessarily thinking about global value chains when they were writing.
Right, and then if we could try to mirror this critique to global value chain analysis in the sense that you were saying before also, because in the global value chain analysis there is this view that companies and states need to upgrade in value chains, in the sense that they need to bring and to add more value, to perform tasks and activities that add more value, as this is a kind of time continuum, that as there is any kind of evolution between low value added activity to high value added activity. But the dependency theories were saying as the world has the developed and the developed world at the same time, and they are both the face of this world productive system, and they are not necessarily a continuation, or there is no time evolution, but they are all actually the different manifestations of this process, this world process. And the same we could think about this the same terms to value chains, in the sense that the low value added activities and the high value added activities are the faces of the same process as well, and they are derived not only due to productive differentials or technological differentials, but also to structural problems and inequalities in between North and South, or between every or each domestic economy as well. Yeah.
That's a really good way of putting it, actually, and I haven't thought of it in that way, but it's so close to how dependency theories were talking about, like, the development of underdevelopment. And I think it stands in so much contrast to global value chain analysis, where it's assumed, okay, you're in Brazil, say, and you're just and the way that the mainstream would think about it is, oh, you just upgrade, and it's like abstracted from the fact that this production is actually happening and like closely connected to a firm in, say, the US that is holding a lot of monopoly power. And as you were saying, it's like the face of the same process. It's not like they are at the equal plane. Actually, they are closely connected, and one is being like directly exploited by the other. So yeah, it's a really nice way of connecting dependency theory to global value chain.
It seems like that. And then when we look now at the disruptions that we had in value chains and the new trends that maybe are happening or maybe not, because we don't have really empirical evidences on that, like reshoring, nearshoring, diversification, reindustrialization of developed countries. And then we see national states like the US, Germany, and China always providing some industrial policies to promote the manufacturing industry in special in their countries. And then we look at that, and then we can think, oh my God, are they going to perform also the low value added activities of the chain? Why do they want the manufacturing or the factories to their territories again? So, but that's because the theory that has been provided to explain these value chains is contradictory with this really functioning of the value chains, because they are a whole process, and the reasons why a certain activity is produced or performed in a place are so complex and depend on so many structural and institutional aspects, including political aspects, that it's impossible to put everything in the same box. That's what I think. And so it's nice to see how contradictory became the narrative now during the pandemic, because we had so many problems, and the companies from developing and developed countries faced so many difficulties. That's true, to keep on producing, that the way that they see these value chains has to be improved, to say the least. And then maybe, I don't know, we can move on to the next question. What do you think about?
Yeah, let's do that. So how do interstate disputes and environmental challenges manifest?
Yeah, maybe I can start talking about the interstate disputes, and I will put this very freely, according to the way I see the thing. Let's see. Of course, it draws on many contributions, but I think that the international productive system has a accumulation process that is closely related to the interstate disputes. So, to say in other words, the wealth and power relations are always interacting, and we cannot talk about the competition of firms without thinking on the roles of the states and the importance of this competition among firms to the states. So then we can, maybe this reminds us of the controversy from the 70s, and also usually from the Anglo-Saxon countries in international political economy, the controversy between the liberalism, the realism, and the Marxist view of international political economy. So we had all this debate between Susan Strange and Wallerstein and Arrighi and Kiorin and Nye, and this always inspires me, and I can say that I am in between the realism and the Marxism, in the sense that I like to emphasize both processes, the competition among states and the competition among capitals. And when we look at the reality nowadays, that we see all this nationalism rising again, and this is really concentrated in the dispute between the US and China, maybe to be the next hegemon of the system, then we see how important it is to never forget that though the transnational corporations are very powerful, they are intrinsically related to the states and to the states' interrelations. That's the way I put this controversy. And so we cannot understand global value chains without understanding the relations among states as well, because this is very important. And then maybe Susan Strange was the first one to see how the diplomacy needs to change to adapt to this new reality of the transnational corporations with globalization, and how these relations are still related to the interstate disputes.
Yeah, I think that's a nice way of framing it. And I don't think it's contradictory. I mean, I think it could all be probably under Marxism, in a way. You're saying like, oh, it's Marxist and realist, but because you have the competition between capitals, which we already talked about, in a sense that, specializing in your competitive advantage is not necessarily going to take you that far, because there's this harsh competition where the weak actually compete against the stronger, and if you're in a peripheral position, then you're likely to lose out. But then, of course, because there's the states also competing with each other, yes, but then there's also the firms that also try to influence the state, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like a kind of a third aspect as well. On multinational, states, yes, they do influence multinational corporations really strongly, but multinational corporations also influence states, like lots of lobbying in all countries. And in both the periphery and the core. I think you're right that that's really important to think about in terms of how to understand global value chains, how they work. And as you said earlier, what is produced where. It's not random. There's geopolitical concerns as well that determine that.
Yeah, and then I must admit that I'm not used to the sustainability theory to talk on development, sustainable development, but of course I assume that we have to consider sustainability since the beginning of the method itself. Epistemologically, we have to include sustainability as much as equality to the way of analyzing each political or economic phenomenon. So what do you think? What are the environmental challenges in terms of theory, making theory, considering all those political and economic aspects that we are talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We always have to everyone has to also bring in the environment now. It's like impossible to just look at the economy abstracted from the environment in this day and age. And in terms of, I think I would bring in dependency theory again, and generally kind of, I guess, theories that like post-colonial theory or decolonial theory as well, looking at how, in order to understand how, like historically, during colonialism and even before, the colonizers or the conquerors or whatever, or like from the beginning, like I talked before about how they set up like extractive production structures, but this also had like very important environmental concerns. Like crucially, a lot of it was about just like extracting raw materials or minerals or whatever it was, and having very bad environmental impacts, which created this structure that is like environmentally very destructive. And the multinational corporations then come in and kind of operate within these kind of extractive structures that were already produced. So it's very easy for multinational corporations to exploit workers or firms and have these very negative environmental consequences. Because that's how part of it maybe is because they don't want to spend the money on sort of protecting the environment, but part of it is also, I guess, that this is how these societies were structured from 200 years ago, 100 years ago, depending on where you are. So I think thinking about the environment, it's important to keep that in mind. So it's not just because a lot, I guess, in the mainstream, when they think about the environment and multinational corporations, it's often about like, oh, you just need to patch a little bit here, a little bit there, provide some clean water, or, kind of small things on the side, and kind of ignoring the fact that this is like a really structural problem that needs to be tackled in a structural way. So yeah, I think maybe that would be a good starting point to kind of critically engage with the environmental impact of
yeah. And well, I think so. That is something that you said that I fully agree that, well, there is all this natural resource-based development in developing countries, and they are usually led by transnational corporations that are exploiting the resources of these places and the different rules of their homelands, let's say, the home countries. So they do what they don't do at home, let's say that like this. But there is also another thing that maybe we can emphasize is that some new sustainability requirements are being pushed by the governments regarding the technological processes. The firms nowadays have to make a sustainability report every year. This is kind of obligatory, and they are rising investments in renewable sources. We are seeing the energy matrix of many countries changing, and this green technologies and these green processes can also become a kind of technological constraint to developing countries or companies from developing countries, especially the micro and small companies, also from the developed world as well. And so maybe this new technological imperative is also a way of concentrating and accumulating, centralizing capital in the most powerful transnational corporations and states of the world system, let's say. And then we have two problems. We have like developing countries that depend on natural resources their economies depends on these natural resource rents. And also we have this new technological paradigm that's not only green. We have all this 4.0 industry, the digitalization, artificial intelligence, and additive manufacturing that are changing the technological paradigms. And this makes even more difficult to the small companies from the developing countries to participate on global value chains. And so the sustainability is also a constraint to the development of developing countries, maybe, right?
Exactly. So it's like because of these like historically produced inequalities, if the multinationals or the core countries are serious about like trying to push for sustainability, then it's not enough to just require small firms in the periphery to do certain things without actually providing the technology or the help for them to be able to do that. Yeah, as you're saying, that's just like binding them in ways that are not really fair or highly unfair. There was another thing that I was thinking about while you were talking that is relevant, I guess, both for sustainability and back to global value chains, which is because although I'm in the UK, I'm originally from Norway, which is one of the countries, it is the country with the highest number of electric cars in the world. Like my brother has a Tesla, my mom has a Tesla.
Great.
Very, very subsidized by the government. So they're like pushing for this green economy, so that everyone should have an electric car by whatever year, which is great, and then you don't have much pollution. But where are these countries produced, and how are they produced? And there's there's a lot of environmental. There's like minerals that go into the car that are extracted from the Congo and other like Central African countries. They're often produced in it's like the car is like the typical kind of global value chain thing where it's produced all around the world. Often like poor working conditions. It could be environmental destruction happening during the production process, but then it gets to Norway and it's like, oh, super clean tech. But the kind of carbon footprint of the car, which is like the parts are travel all around the world, isn't really considered as a part of that when like Norwegians think about how green they are. So that's another unequal aspect of all this green tech stuff. That is often that these products are usually consumed in the rich countries rather than the poor countries.
Yeah, and Norway is a good example also that reminds us the dependence and developmentalism period because Norway is an example of natural resource-led development, but in a good sense. So natural resources is not always a curse, as the mainstream literature like to talk about. It can be a bless if the political institutions change the game, let's say. We
like to think that, but it's still oil, right? So it's still oil. Not environmentally friendly, exactly. Even though it's technologically advanced or whatever. It's
and then we're talking about renewables, renewable energy precisely, and this is another center of these interstate disputes that we are going to watch in the next decades. So when China and the US promised that they will become carbon neutral in 30 or 40 years, we can imagine that there will be a huge investment in renewables, in renewable technology, in renewable infrastructure. And this is something that you can do if you have capital to finance this expansion. And then we know that the availability of these financial conditions is also very uneven across countries, and it's usually easier to do that if you have the international currency, right? If you are the US and most of the contracts worldwide are in dollars, then you can raise your investment rate easier than the other countries. So this is another aspect that we have to look at, and maybe it can be also, and this is something that we have to empirically investigate, is it can be a niche to some companies from developing countries to grow. Can be. So there is a kind of opportunity here, but it must be that all the structural and institutional conditions must be created to this opportunity become true. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. And I mean, there is an opportunity, but it's very difficult to capitalize on that opportunity unless there's like heavy investment in it, right? So China has, been able to produce a lot of green energy sources and technology. So, but that's because of heavy investment into that, partly for their own sake because there's so much pollution, and partly in order to become competitive internationally. So I think, but like a country like Ecuador might not be able to do that so easily because you do need a lot of investment, and that's really hard. And I guess also, you need to like developing technology is, it's not like something that you can easily do if you're starting for like a small firm. It's not really able to like develop advanced technology. You need like bigger firms, lots of scientists. So there's an opportunity, but it's hard to, I think it's not easy to capitalize. Probably it's harder for developing countries to capitalize on it than advanced countries. But yeah, there is some, I mean, there's like you could do some leapfrogging and stuff, but that's maybe not really exactly related to what you were saying, but in terms of like Kenya, like famously not developing the landlines, like phone landlines, but just going straight to like digital or payment systems, and like going straight to digital payment systems and mobile phones. So like not even adopting the kind of old infrastructures, but just going straight to the
yes, this is another example that this development is not a time continuous. You can like do like some leapfrogs, as the literature like to use this term, but it depends.
Yeah, you're right. Actually, using the leapfrogging term makes it sound like it's a stages thing. Yeah, so I apologize for using the language.
Yeah, and then we can also move to the next question, because we are about to talk about this, because so there are distributional consequences of these changes that we are seeing in global value chains and in the governance of transnational corporations related to the pandemic, related to the new technological paradigm of sustainability, and also of Industry 4.0, and this will for sure have distributional effects, including the so-called intersectional differences, right? So, well, I think that the structuralist theory has always pointed to this distributional asymmetries between core and periphery, center and periphery. I really prefer to use the word center because I think it's more connected to the original in Spanish and in Portuguese, but doesn't matter. And also the dependency theory, right? So I think that both of them were very clear in talking about how there are differences regarding the developed countries and the developing countries, but also the differences in domestic economies between classes, and then also between gender and ethnical racial groups. Though, in my opinion, you know about this, Ingrid, I think that the pioneers of these theories didn't put so much emphasis on the gender and racial differences, but I think that they can be not only incorporated, but they can become again the epistemological standpoint to understand the process that are going on, right? I don't know if I was clear enough.
I think you're spot on. It's you're right that like I think these theories, structuralist or dependency, or like Marxist theories, highlight not just the inequality between center and periphery, but also the inequalities within the periphery, and how like they were looking at how like I don't know, Furtado and Singer, several were like looking at how in the periphery in particular, there's like I forget the terminology that they use, but there's often like a divide where there's the production that is like export processing zones maybe, or like a cleavage of like some production, and then like and the rest of the economy. There's like a much more inequality in that sense than in the center. And the way that the sort of global production is structured also kind of reinforces these inequalities within, which is the economic aspect, but then there's also the gendered and racial aspect that dependency theories didn't talk about that much. Some of the Latin American structuralists did talk about race. I haven't. This is on my like to-do list to like look more into that literature. But Cristobal Kay reviews it a little bit in his book, But
Yeah.
I think even if, the ones that didn't talk about it, you can incorporate it. And
Yeah, in the past there wasn't many. Yeah, but in Brazil especially. But I think that in the other Latin America countries there were some theorists of the colonization. So we have Mariátegui, Quijano, and also some Marxists that were looking into this racial and gender relations. We had Milton Santos from geography fields, geography sciences, but I think that the material approach or the class struggle was being privileged against any other struggle like intersectional struggle. And this worries me a lot, and it took me a while to realize that, to be honest, because I think I had this economicist and Eurocentric formation both in my master and also in my PhD in economics. And though we were looking to the structuralist theory, we were not critically thinking on how Eurocentric was the way of seeing development. And then when I got into the African theory, the other Latin American theorists, and also the colonial thinking in a broad sense, I was astonished. I said, wow, how didn't I realize that before, that we need to change the way of seeing things and start talking about what's development to each people, and what does development mean, and then what are we going to do to reach development, and how are we going to develop our productive forces, and how are we going to improve the distribution among the different groups of the societies. So those questions, I think, are very striking, very important, and very difficult to deal in an interdisciplinary way and complex method, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you that it's, like bringing in race and gender doesn't mean neglecting the materialist sort of structure either, because I think as some of the scholars in the Black radical tradition do bring in like imperialism, production. They have obviously a Marxist approach, and also look at race. And some of the scholars that kind of build on them and look at production, look at how generally like global value chains tend to, or like the way production is structured tends to not just like exploit workers in the periphery, but also exploit those that are already in a subordinate position. So that would be, well, depending on the country, what race is at which race is at the bottom of the hierarchy is different from country to country. But and in terms of gender, that's generally women, right? That tend to be sort of super exploited in the words of Marini. So I think that's really important and fits very well into a kind of dependency approach, even if they didn't necessarily engage with it directly themselves. So in terms of global value chains in particular, I was reading the other day about Kate Meagher's work, where she doesn't take a dependency approach like explicitly, but she looks specifically at how global value chains are raced in South Africa. And working in chains, she finds how especially Black workers are kind of exploited, especially in South Africa. It makes sense because it's already a very unequal racial structure in the country. So when a foreign company comes in, they take advantage of the inequalities that are already there.
Yeah, and once you brought Marini, and I think we can think about these structural differences in these terms still nowadays in global value chains, in the sense that we do have the exploitation of labor in developed countries, but in the developing world, we have the super exploitation of labor, and especially Black and indigenous people, and of women, right? And there are a lot of data that show how different are the wages, for example, between these groups in the societies, not only in Brazil, but in many countries. But I think that looking into wages is not enough, because the racism, the misogyny are structural, and so they manifest not only in economic variables, but also in variables that we cannot measure, like how do people feel, the feelings of people. So in this sense, you were talking about some new literature. I think that Silvio Almeida from Brazil, talking about the structural racism, brings an interesting contribution. And also, I don't know if you heard about him, Akili Mbembe. He's in Harvard, but he's from Africa.
No, that's I don't recall the work of this this scholar, but it sounds really relevant for understanding the inequalities and exploitation that's happening, and really necessary to include. Mbembe. I do know Mbembe. Okay, yeah.
Yes, from maybe my pronunciation. Yeah.
Okay. But I never made the connection in the way that you did. So that's really good. And I think it's really important that it's not just about wages, right? You can measure inequality in wages, but there's how people feel discriminated against, or people who are excluded from even having a wage. Or there's a lot of literature in the feminist by feminist scholars that is like, it's not just about the wage, but it's about the kinds of jobs that are often like more dangerous, less protected, more precarious. So there's all these other, I think maybe they're a bit more measurable than a feeling, but they're still not just about the wage. That affects especially people that are already in a position where they're being discriminated against. So it's not just workers generally, but like women and people of color. So that's really important as well to take into account when we try to figure out like what can we do about this unequal structure.
Yeah. And maybe just to contextualize to what's actually currently happening in global value chains, you can remember that if the system is becoming more concentrated because of the technological change, for example, or the financial improvements that are being made by the transnational corporations to keep or to raise their value, their profits and the profit rates, let's say too, then the class struggle and the intersectional struggles are going to become more dense, more intensified, and then the distribution is going to get worse, and more people will be out of this productive system and this international flows of capitals and goods and services. And when this happens, some facts that we can observe historically, if we look to the past, are at least two. We can see the political positions become more polarized. So the conservative view is getting power, is getting more powerful, and also there is more discussion, or there are new narratives coming from the left wing positions as well. And then we hear about socialism and people thinking about another productive modes and how to change the system, and at least how to reform the system. So there are maybe new alternatives being created, debated, and improved. And we, from the progressive side, we hope, right, that these new alternatives become more democratic in the sense that they are not developed by intellectuals or academic stuff that are a bit far away from the reality or the day-to-day life of poor people and the majority of the world population. So we need new alternatives to this to the productive modes, to the way that the system is organized. But I think that these alternatives must be popular, in the sense that the people build them, not they are from the bottom up and not top down approaches. And I think that this is the most difficult thing to participate, to contribute, and to build this kind of approaches. I don't know.
Yeah, and especially now, like in a time of crisis, somehow these popular progressive movements don't tend to do well in times of crisis. It's like in booms, you can have, it's easier when there's not like so much competition for resources. When there's lots of competition for resources, the conservatives tend to do well, because then it's, I guess, the elites that are like really pushing the more conservative agenda. And you kind of see that now with a wave of austerity already happening in a lot of the developing worlds, like in the wake of COVID. So it's really important at this moment to try to, I mean, it's really hard, but also even more important. I don't know if you can hear that ambulance. No, it's very loud, but yeah. So it's really, really important to push for that, but also incredibly difficult. People know, well, I don't know. People are like more scared about their paycheck, I guess, than in normal times, because it's a time of crisis. So maybe it's more risky to go for a unknown alternative than the conservative, I don't know, the one you already know. It's not going to cause a massive currency depreciation if we're always elected again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you were right. In the wake of COVID, so many contradictions emerged. Like, for example, we see that the states played such a big role to deal or to tackle the COVID, to decide about the isolation measures, the anti-cyclical political policies, economic policies. But in many countries, we see that the way that these economic policies are going to now, instead of emphasizing the role of the state, are actually trying to again make the state minimal. It's not really minimal, right? But it is like less intervenient and letting more space to the markets and to the private interests. And so this is a contradiction that we see already. And despite the importance of the state during the crisis, still this conservative view of the state is getting stronger in many places. And so, as I said, there is a kind of lack of alternative that sounds pragmatic and that people think that can be successful. So it's very, I worry a lot about this. Yeah.
So countries in the center had a very strong fiscal policy. It's being rolled back now. They're trying to roll it back in the UK. But yeah, so it was like, so they're saying, and then through the IMF and the World Bank basically saying, well, don't do like us. You shouldn't have expansive fiscal policy, even though we had it for like a year and a half. It's very hypocritical, maybe not atypical of given the current the global economy that we live in. But it's very hypocritical. And also, I mean, the IMF was saying, we're not going to push for austerity now, on the global stage of the World Economic Forum and stuff. But then they do. When they go to the countries and they yeah, so it's again like saying one thing when they're on the center stage and then pushing for, not really trusting governments in the periphery to actually spend responsibly. That's even during a pandemic, even in a health crisis, when you need like to spend on just health, basic health stuff, they were still in some instances pushing for like privatization of healthcare. So yeah, it's just absolutely horrifying, really. So yeah, we'll see. Well, now that things are, I mean, we're going into third wave, aren't we, in a lot of countries. So it's not like the pandemic is over anytime soon. And then there's the vaccine inequality as well that we haven't even talked about yet, which is another dependency, another manifestation of dependency, and technological inequalities. When we see who has access to vaccines and not. Yeah, which is something that's easy to organize around, I guess. I think a lot of youth and a lot of left-wing people in the global north are very angry about the vaccine inequalities.
Yeah, and then in this sense, maybe to, I don't know, start to go to the end of our dialogue, I see that I really, nowadays, I have difficulty to understand the North and South division as a division that is built upon where the person is placed, basically, because we see many people from the global North that are really concerned about the problems of the global South and the other way around as well. And we also have many thinkers or analysts and intellectuals from the North and South that are trying to build a more plural approach that is concerned to the world problems, not only the North, the problems that the North consider like priority. But still, it's very difficult to build non-Eurocentric perspectives. And in my view, this is because we still didn't really understand the meaning of development to each country. And then we come to the beginning of the conversation again, because once we don't have this a final concept, and we'll never have, right? Because this is a dynamic concept of development. It's difficult to make like development theories that are broad and general. I think that these do not exist and will not exist never, because they really depend on the local peoples, what local people want. So yeah, I think we have to keep fighting against what we were talking about, like this view that development is a time continuum, that it's built by individual agents that are acting according to their own interests, and then we have to adopt methodologies that are more structural and trying to cover a wider range of factors that influence the development path. You said that maybe you could point to some non-Eurocentric approach that you like, right? And along the lines of the People's Green New Deal, maybe then we could finish with that. I don't know.
Yeah. So I liked what you said about, and I think it's important to, because sometimes dependency theory is also straw man to be like, oh, the center versus the periphery is like an absolute thing. And I think it's important to kind of go beyond that, is what you were saying, that like, you know, there's obviously people within the center that show a lot of solidarity with people in the periphery. And I think also within the periphery, there's people that are acting in the interest of the center. So you have like, you know, political battles within both. And there's, of course, politicians, organizers, whatever, people in the center and the periphery that have taken on Eurocentric and Eurocentric approaches. So the task is really to kind of build coalitions across, like globally, between these non-Eurocentric approaches, which I think is the only way if we want to, reduce global inequality. So yeah, I had the example of the People's Green New Deal. I haven't read the book yet. It just came out recently. It's by Max Agel, who uses dependency theory, and he's going against this kind of Eurocentric view of the Green New Deal, which is basically about green infrastructure and like electric cars and whatever in the global north, and not taking into account all the destruction that has happened throughout colonialism and is currently still happening. All the extraction that happens causing negative effects for the periphery. So he's kind of developing this anti-colonial view, and many others. I mean, there's many approaches to kind of anti-colonial green policies, which I think is the only way. The climate change is a global problem, so we can't solve it just within the global north or just within the center. It needs to be a global thing where we address the particular challenges faced in the periphery as well. So that's one example of a non-Eurocentric approach to this massive problem that we're facing.
Yeah, that's great. And then you just remembered that in the dependency theory, we had this recommendation, let's say, of union of some of this coalitions between through coalitions among workers worldwide, right? And this is also, let's say, very old in the sense that, I don't know, Marx was already saying that. And so not only the workers, and as we were saying, the women, the Black people, the indigenous of many countries should make coalitions and try to figure out how to establish alternatives to get into power and to raise their influence in the state action, to really get some policies that are according to more democratic interests, rather than, as we see, especially in developing countries, states captured by some minority interests. And this is something that is historical and very difficult to change. Maybe now this seems even more difficult, but it's, of course, it's not a good thing to compare this. But yes, but I think that our role now is what we are doing now, is start to reflect together. How can we build the resources to make this coalition and to strengthen these coalitions, right?
Yeah, it's probably not less difficult, but it feels like it's even more urgent. I mean, it probably was always urgent, but now with the pandemic and climate change is getting even worse. It's and global inequality is getting worse. It's have to make bigger efforts and just keep trying. And I guess your series is one effort to that to that end. Creating dialogue is the first step. So.
Let's try. I think that we have this decision right together, you and me and all the researchers that are participating, to talk and to listen. And it's very important to listen to the others, right? And so I really appreciate your time and I appreciate that you shared so many insightful thoughts. Thank you very much, Ingrid. It was very nice for me. I learned a lot.
Thank you for having me. I also learned a lot, and it was very stimulating. So I'm very happy to have been a part of it.